Heritage Area, which is headquartered at the University of North Alabama. That's what I was asking about your shirt. I moved to Florence about 8 years ago. I started out teaching in the history department as a professor, but when this job opened up about 3 years ago, I decided I wanted to take it, and I'll tell you why. It's a pretty fun job. I get to do lots of cool things. So I'm going to talk with you all today about the Tennessee River and Northwest Alabama. And we're sort of going to talk about the development of the river, the people that have lived along the river, how people have shaped the river and changed the river. And so we'll learn a lot, and we'll talk a lot about things that happened here in Decatur along the way. So the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area, which I'm the director of, was designated by Congress in 2009. We are a partnership program with the National Park Service. So we're not a national park, but our money comes from the National Park Service. So we work on projects in a 6-county region, and our 6 counties are Colbert County, Franklin County, Lauderdale, Lawrence, Limestone, and Morgan. So we do a lot of projects here in Decatur. So we take money from the National Park Service and we use it to partner with organizations, a lot of whom who you're hearing from today. So the Cooks Museum, Morgan County Archives, City of Decatur. We've worked on a lot of projects with them to help to preserve, protect, and interpret natural, cultural, and historic resources. So we work on projects to help parks, to make sure that we're protecting our natural environment. We work on a lot of projects to help fund events or things that are cultural, so a lot of music projects. We work to help fund the restoration of historic buildings. We develop curriculum for schools about our history. So I get to do a whole lot of different stuff all of the time, and I get to travel around the 6 counties, and I get to work with people who love our history and our culture in our region, which is really exciting. I'm not from here originally. I'm originally from Connecticut. I find the climate down here much better than it is in Connecticut, right? No snow, or minimal snow. And so it's been really exciting for me then too to learn Alabama's history, right? And to learn how important the history of our region specifically is. National Heritage Areas, there's only 55 of them in the entire country. Right? So for us to be designated one by Congress means that our story here is of national significance. Things happened here that have helped to shape our national story. Now, unfortunately, right, when you take high school history, they have to cover so much, right, in such a short amount of time that you don't often get to go really in depth into your local history, right, and really understand how those national issues and stories connect to things happening right here. But we're going to talk about how they did connect to our story here. For our heritage area, we focus on 3 main themes. Our music history, we have an internationally significant music story, largely centered in Muscle Shoals, but also over here there were a number of studios in Decatur, and then in Limestone County we have the Old Time Fiddlers Convention, so a lot of old time music that's nationally significant. Native American heritage, which we're going to start off by talking about today, and then the Tennessee River itself, right? This is the largest feature in our landscape. It has shaped life here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so it is of great significance. Now, those 6 counties that I mentioned to you, those counties are all connected to a stretch of the river known as Muscle Shoals. So today when we think of Muscle Shoals, we think of the town, right? Over by Florence. But historically, it was this long stretch of the river. Now, there is some argument about the spelling, right? Muscle, and why it would be called Muscle Shoals. Most people think it was actually mussel as in like the shellfish, M-U-S-S-E-L. And that at one point there was someone misspelled it as mussel, right? And it became Muscle Shoals that way. Now, other people will argue that the shoals, which were a long stretch of 40 miles of shallow, rocky river, needed a lot of muscle, okay, if you were going to navigate them. So there's 2 camps on why we were named Muscle Shoals. So this is a picture of the river when it is very low and actually before the dams were built. And we're going to talk about the construction of Wilson Dam and Wheeler Dam today. So at one time, when the water was really low, you could actually walk in some places from one side of the river to the other. When we drive over the river today, it's a very different river. It's very deep in most places. It would be impossible for us to walk from one side to the other unless we're walking over a bridge. But when this picture was taken, which was sometime before 1918, when the first dam construction began, shows you just how shallow it could be. These rocks and rapids and sandbars made it really difficult for boats to travel between Florence and Decatur. And so that stretch of the river has then resulted in some incredible feats of engineering that we're going to talk about after we talk a little bit about the people who lived here first. So our landscape is also shaped by the river. We have the river, which has at its base a layer of chert, right, which is a type of stone that is very hard to manipulate. But on the banks of the river are beds of limestone. And limestone is not very difficult to manipulate. Right? And over thousands, millions of years, right, water seeps into limestone and creates caves. So we have thousands of caves around our 6 counties in the limestone, which at one time would have been next to the river today because the river shape has changed. Sometimes you find caves like this, which is actually in Morgan County. This is a Sans Souci cave. You find them a ways away from where the river is today. Now, in the winter months, going back to about 12,000 years ago, Paleo-Indian people who first lived here would seek shelter in these caves. During the summer months, they lived down by the edge of the river, eating mussels, fishing, catching animals, foraging for wild berries and fruits, and eventually then moving towards a more sustainable form of agriculture as well. But at one time, the Tennessee River Valley, and specifically this area, was one of the most densely populated places thousands of years ago because of the river. Right? The river provided food, it provided a way to travel, right? And because of these limestone banks, it provided shelter for the people that lived here. Now I've got another picture. This is of an archaeological excavation. This was taken in the 1930s as they were constructing Wheeler Dam. They begin to do a series of archaeological excavations before the river changes course and floods a lot of the places that Native Americans lived along the banks of the river. So they were conducted by TVA and the WPA. And this was actually of a shell midden. Right? So when people lived along the banks of the river and they ate all of that shellfish, all of the mussels out of the river, they threw the mussel shells in big piles. And some of these piles could reach like 30 feet. Right? They're big, huge trash dumps. Right? And then eventually those big piles come covered with dirt and grass. Right? So all along the river there would be these huge mounds. We still have some mounds along the river today, but they are not shell middens, most of them. Like if you think about the Florence Indian mound, that's a mound that was made out of dirt, out of earth. But these shell mounds were really fascinating because they were garbage dumps. Right? If anyone's interested in archaeology, a lot of what you do is dig in other people's trash. Okay? So they were throwing these shells in there, but then they threw bits of pottery and they threw fish hooks. Right? So you're able to, by excavating them, learn a lot about the Native American people who lived here. Now, we're celebrating Alabama's Bicentennial, right? So we need to talk about why Alabama becomes a state in 1819 and how that impacts the people that are living here, right, along the river. So after the American Revolution, right, people begin to push further and further west, right? When the British forces are defeated and they have to give up control of where people are settling. Americans who had wanted to move west and were hindered by the British begin to push further and further west, Tennessee, right? And then they begin to push further south into Alabama, what is today Alabama and Mississippi as well. Now, they are looking, a lot of them, for land. They're looking for land to grow cotton. Cotton had become a huge cash crop after an important invention was made in 1793. Anybody know what that invention was? Cotton gin, right? Invented by Eli Whitney. And the cotton gin made the cleaning of cotton much easier and faster, right? Allowing the crop to increase in value. Now, as a result of that increase in value, right, people wanted more and more and more land to grow cotton. And they saw Alabama and Mississippi as prime areas to do so. But there are already people living here, right? Native Americans. Right? They've been living here for thousands of years. And we are in the midst of Cherokee and Chickasaw land. People lived, hunted, right, all along our river valley. And as settlers begin to come in the late 1700s and then into the early 1800s, they're illegally here. Right? They're on Native American land. And so eventually the government, U.S. government, begins to sign a series of treaties taking more and more and more land away from Native Americans. Now there's another group of people, right, who are brought here as a result of cotton. So on the one hand, cotton is leading to Native Americans losing their land, but it's also resulting in a huge spike in the number of enslaved people who are brought into Alabama. So it's a complicated crop, right, with a very complicated history. Alabama and Mississippi, the population of enslaved peoples skyrockets, right, in the early 1800s, even before we become a state, right? And that has a long legacy for our history here in the state, right? Very complicated story. Now, because of the Muscle Shoals, right, if you're going to grow cotton here, you've got a problem, right? If you're growing cotton in Decatur and you want to send it west, right, if you send it west onto the Tennessee River, eventually the Tennessee River connects into the Ohio River, and then do you know what river it connects into after that? What river ends in New Orleans? Mississippi, right? So you can go from Decatur, if you can get around the Muscle Shoals, all the way to New Orleans by water. Right? And New Orleans, right, in the 1800s is one of the largest ports in the United States. So people want to ship their cotton there, right, and then have it go to international markets or travel back up to New England where it can be turned into fabric in the cotton mills of New England. Right? So there's a problem. We also have this problem with all of the Native Americans, right, losing their land. We have problems with white settlers coming in with enslaved people and squatting on Native American lands. So eventually, by 1818, enough Native American territory had been ceded to the United States that they were able to become an independent territory of Mississippi. And then in 1819, we became a state, right, because of this very complicated crop of cotton, right, which has a legacy then for all three groups of people that's pretty dramatic. So even after we signed the treaties and reduced Native American control of land, there was still a desire to see Native Americans removed completely from our landscape. So did you all learn about the Indian Removal Act in U.S. history? Do you remember that? Signed by President Jackson in 1830. Right? And with the signage of Indian removal, all of the tribes that were still living east of the Mississippi River were moved west of the Mississippi River. Anybody know what state Indian Territory became today? They were moved to Oklahoma, right, to Indian Territory, and now it eventually became the state of Oklahoma. Now, this happened all over the eastern part of the United States. It happened up around the Great Lakes, right? But we had a really large Native American population here in our region. Thousands of people, right, had to be removed west of the Mississippi. Now, a lot of those people traveled by foot. A lot of people traveled by boat and various routes. But here in the Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area, people travel by foot, they travel by boat, and they travel by railroad. In Decatur, was the terminus of the TC&D Railroad. The other terminus was in Tuscumbia. So this railroad was built in the 1830s to get around that Muscle Shoals, that 40-mile stretch. So people that were shipping cotton, right, people that were wanting to move along the stretch of the river that you couldn't travel by boat, began to use the railroad. Now this railroad was built in 1833. In 1833, the technology of the railroad had only been in the United States for around 10 years. Okay, so this is the first railroad west of the Appalachian Mountains, is right here. And railroads go on to play an enormously important role in our country, right, until really the mid-20th century, when we begin to see more automobile and truck usage moving goods around the country. So that happened here, and you can go visit the Decatur Depot over in Old Decatur and learn more about this history, right? Really significant. We're talking about nationally significant stories. So here, do y'all know where Rhodes Ferry Park is? Right? So Native Americans were taken off of barges at Rhodes Ferry Park, put on the railroad, taken to Tuscumbia, where they were taken off the railroad and put back on barges. Then they traveled up to the Ohio, to the Mississippi, down to the Arkansas River, all the way out to Oklahoma. So we're the only place where we see people traveling by foot and by railroad and by water on the Trail of Tears. The river also, as we think about moving deeper into the 19th century, the river also plays an important role in how the Civil War unfolds here. This is actually the bridge in Decatur, which was burned during the war. Y'all know where the Old State Bank is? So that's actually this building right here. So the Old State Bank was one of 4 buildings in Decatur that survived the Civil War. The rest of the town was dismantled. It wasn't burned, it was dismantled so that the wood could be used by the Union Army. So really interesting story, right? There's a lot of back and forth in our region because of the river. People wanted to control it, right? They wanted to control the railroad, and they wanted to control the river, because controlling the river means that you can travel, right? East and west. You can connect to the Mississippi River. You can move all the way up into Tennessee to Knoxville. So controlling the river becomes very, very important during the war. Now, if there was no bridge, how did people cross the river? You know what they used to use to cross the river? Boats, right? Ferries. I was thinking when the last group, I was sad. I've got a great picture of this bridge rebuilt with a ferry still traveling below it, right? So even when there were bridges, people still used ferries to cross the river. Okay? And again, this river is a very different river than the one we see today. Much wider, much shallower, and you could, in some places, like we saw in that other picture, sometimes even walk all the way across the river. After the Civil War, we have a lot of problems, right? The Southern economy, because of the end of the institution of slavery, is in shambles. We have a large population of formerly enslaved people who are now looking for opportunities for their families, to provide for them, to own land. Right? There's a lot of tension, right, between the two groups, right? Southerners who wanted to preserve their way of life, and this now large group across the South of over 4 million people who had been enslaved, who now wanted to embrace their freedom, participate in politics, right, own land, have an education. So there's a lot of tensions. But there's also a lot of opportunity. One thing I didn't realize when I first moved to Alabama was just how much industry there was in our corridor because of the Tennessee River in the wake of the Civil War. So by the 1880s, 1890s, as the economy begins to recover, right, because of the connectivity, right, that ability to move goods, even with the Muscle Shoals, right, still causing problems, this was a great place if you were going to build a factory. Right? So we have textile factories. In Florence, we had the Florence Wagon Works, which was the second largest producer of wagons in the entire North American continent. And those industries thrive because of the river. But at the same time, right, there's this problem of the Muscle Shoals, right? How do we deal with the shoals? Back in the 1830s, as they were building the railroad, the first Muscle Shoals Canal was constructed, but it was a miserable failure. It filled in with dirt and silt pretty much immediately and was unusable. Then the Civil War happens. And then in 1868, the Army Corps of Engineers decides to try again. So the second Muscle Shoals Canal construction begins in the late 1860s. Now, the people that they initially used to build this canal are formerly enslaved people. So in the wake of the war, in an attempt to control the newly freed, formerly enslaved peoples, a system of laws was passed that resulted in much higher punishments for crimes for African Americans, and they ended up in prison camps. And those prisoners then could be leased out by those prison camps in a system called convict labor. So the prison camp would make money leasing formerly enslaved people who have now essentially been re-enslaved out for projects like this, or they could be leased out to plantations where they were once again put to work growing and harvesting cotton. Now eventually, with the construction of the canal, they move away from convict labor and begin hiring workers, and they build a canal that allows you to travel around the Muscle Shoals through a series of locks. There are 9 locks. None of them are too large. You can see down here there's a little drop off, right? So this would be the lock. You'd come in here, right? And then this water would fill up, right, to the top, then the gates would open and the water would go down and you would go down the hill into the next lock. Pretty fascinating technology. Now, they kind of struggled. It took them about 30 years to finish this project. And the man that was overseeing it was a man named George Washington Goethals at the end. So he's the one that is credited with the completion of the canal. And he would go on and build another canal called the Culver Shoals Canal. That's below the Muscle Shoals Canal. He goes on to oversee the construction of the Panama Canal. So he gains his experience here, okay, that goes on to allow him to build the largest canal, right, that is still in use today. So again, that connection to these national and international stories, things that happen here, are of huge significance. It's not until the 20th century, however, that the river is mostly tamed. And this is through the construction of a series of dams, the first of which is Wilson Dam, which connects Florence and Muscle Shoals. Now, when this dam was built, it was the largest concrete gravity-fed dam in the world. Okay? It represented millions of dollars of work, brand new technology. It also represented the lives of a number of people who were killed during the construction. The lock system, which allows you to travel through the dam, is still under construction in this picture down here. But when the 2-lock system opened, the double lock system is the largest lock system in the world. The single lock, when it opened in the 1960s, was the largest lock in the world. And then still remains today the largest lock east of the Rocky Mountains. So again, nationally significant. So Wilson Dam was built right at the end, or construction started right at the end of World War I. It was initially thought that the dam would power factories that were producing explosives for the war effort, but the war ended about 6 months after construction began. And so the dam was never put to that use. So then the question became, what do you do with this dam? They finished it in 1926. Then the Depression happens, right? Beginning in 1929. And it's not until 1933 when President Roosevelt is elected. This is people in Sheffield, right on the river, waiting for Roosevelt to come on the train to visit. So Roosevelt creates TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which then worked to create jobs, educational opportunity, and also constructed additional dams along the river, right? Making the river we know today. So the TVA system becomes part of our national significant story.
Attention please, teachers and students. Please transition